Standing at over 7 feet tall, the Great Khali was one of the most physically intimidating wrestlers to ever step foot in a wrestling ring. As the first ever Indian-born WWE World Heavyweight Champion, Khali became a hero to millions back in his home country. But despite that success, his life has been filled with personal struggles, devastating tragedies and incredible hardship. He was born Dalip Singh Rana and he grew up in a poor farming family in India. A devastating monsoon in 1979 destroyed their crops, which forced him to leave school in order to help support his family. He got a job on a plantation where his massive size made him perfect for grueling work, but it also made him a target for bullies. But despite that hardship and the taunting that he faced on a daily basis, his resilience only grew stronger, and that strength eventually landed him a position as a police officer. The pay from being a police officer allowed him to buy his first ever television set, and it was on that small screen that he first discovered pro wrestling. He was incredulous at the action that he saw on TV because it was the first time that he'd ever seen anyone else that looked like him. Now Khali had the dream of becoming a wrestling superstar. After saving what seemed like a fortune, Khali managed to travel from India to California, where he signed up for wrestling classes at a promotion called All Pro Wrestling. For Khali, moving all the way to the US was a massive culture shock. He didn't speak much English and his communication was limited to nods and gestures, which obviously made training incredibly difficult. A huge opportunity came when WCW signed him to a contract in 2000, but he never made a single televised appearance. By March 2001, WCW had been sold to the WWF and they didn't pick up his contract. Khali had no choice but to go back to square one and back to training. But in May 2001, tragedy struck. Khali was practicing a basic power move with fellow trainee Brian Ong when a misstep turned fatal. As Khali lifted Ong, Ong grabbed his shirt, causing the move to go off course. Ong's head snapped back as he landed and the impact killed him. Though Khali wasn't blamed for the accident, the weight of it stayed with him. It was a devastating and life-changing moment. But Khali didn't quit. He carried on chasing his dream. Soon enough, he was wrestling in Japan and Mexico, and for Vince McMahon, he was now too big to ignore. In April 2006, the Great Khali debuted on SmackDown by stepping over the top rope and staring down The Undertaker, and then he destroyed the dead man like he was nothing. Vince McMahon wasn't messing around when it came to pushing Khali. He squashed the likes of Funaki and Rey Mysterio on the way to his first pay-per-view match against The Undertaker at Judgment Day. Very few people have ever dominated The Undertaker like this in a straight-up singles match, and as the dust settled, the fans quickly realised that Khali wasn't exactly very good in the ring. Even with him being protected in short matches, his lack of mobility and skill really stood out. But despite all of that, Vince McMahon was hell-bent on pushing him. The two men were booked for a rematch at the Great American Bash. This was going to be the first ever Punjabi prison match, with WWE promoting the stipulation as Khali's personal creation. But just days before the event, Khali was pulled from the match due to having elevated liver enzymes. While there was no suggestion of wrongdoing on Khali's part, WWE took no chances and replaced him in the Punjabi prison match by The Big Show. In 2007, John Cena was at his peak. This was a time where he was more like a superhero than a wrestler, and the Great Khali was his next challenger. The matches were terrible, and the fans really didn't want to see Khali in this position, competing for the WWE title. At WrestleMania 23, he faced Kane in one of the worst WrestleMania matches of all time, But that wasn't going to stop Vince from pushing him all the way to the top. Vince McMahon's fascination with giants is well known, but Khali's push was also about him wanting to break into the Indian market. India had long been seen as an untapped market for professional wrestling, and Vince thought that Khali was the magic ticket to getting his countrymen into watching WWE. When Edge vacated the World Heavyweight Championship due to an injury, WWE held a 20-man battle royal to crown a new champion, and Khali eliminated Kane and Batista in one move to win. For fans in India, it was a huge moment, but in reality, it was a cynical piece of marketing to try and attract more of those fans. And fans everywhere else hated seeing Khali as the World Heavyweight Champion. He was just too big. Watching Khali wrestle wasn't like seeing Andre the Giant in his prime. Andre could move with a surprising amount of agility for his size. Khali, on the other hand, was actually painful to watch, and while WWE protected him by keeping most of his matches short, there was no hiding the fact that Khali's offense was incredibly basic. It usually just boiled down to a chop, a boot, and the occasional slam. But Khali's size was actually the result of a disease called acromegaly. This condition is caused by a tumour on the pituitary gland, which leads to excessive growth hormone being produced. Over time, it causes enlarged bones, joint pain, and severe mobility issues. In many ways, Khali's health problems were a ticking clock. He only held the title for 61 days before losing it to Batista, but that was just enough time for Vince to market him in India as a former world champion. But at the same time, Khali's body was breaking down. His knees were the first things to give out. After years of carrying over 400 pounds, he had terrible knee pain and he had no choice but to undergo double knee surgery. After coming back from that, he was even more limited in the ring than he was before. Doctors discovered that the tumour on his pituitary gland was putting pressure on his brain. He underwent emergency surgery to remove the tumour, which in the end saved his life. WWE shifted Khali into a mid-card comedy role and he was transformed into the Punjabi playboy. He went from being a world champion to planting kisses on random women in the crowd. But just as Khali's character became a joke, Jinder Mahal arrived in 2011. Jinder was introduced as Khali's brother-in-law, who claimed that Khali had brought shame to their family by humiliating himself on TV. The angle played heavily into cultural stereotypes, and Khali was reportedly very uncomfortable with the storyline. And the fans back in India also found the whole thing to be very offensive to their culture. By the time 2014 rolled around, Khali's appearances had become few and far between, and he'd been wanting to leave WWE for quite some time. The shift in his character and the feud with Jinder Mahal had left him very frustrated. So when his contract expired in November 2014, he was happy to go. In 2015, he went home to India and founded his own promotion and wrestling school. He briefly made a return to WWE in 2017 and 2018 when he entered the Greatest Royal Rumble, and he was inducted into the Hall of Fame a couple of years later. Khali's entire life has been shaped by pain, but he managed to leave the wrestling business standing tall.